So I thought if we're going to start talking about the Henriad, that the ruins of my garage would be a suitable location. Now, we've already talked about Richard II's speech about the death of kings when we were looking at Hamlet. With Richard II, being a king is always a performance, that is, the playing of a play. Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown, you have to think of the hollow as both empty and sacred, because Richard II will always be thinking about his sacred state, that rounds the mortal temples of a king, right, because it goes around their head, keeps death his court, and there the antic or like jester sits scoffing his state as king, right? Like death is like a jester laughing at the king and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, a little play acting to monarchize, to pretend to play the king, be feared, and kill with looks. You saw this already in Hamlet. Remember, there's a player king and a player queen playing out a little scene of murder. So what is this play, Richard II? So what is Richard II? Well, in the first folio, it's considered part of the histories. Under the histories, we find the life and death of Richard II. It's also the first part of a 4-part series or tetralogy based on English history, now called the Henriad. Now, a tetralogy is a 4-part work. You're more familiar with a trilogy of 3 parts, like in Star Wars. So that means the Henriad is made up of 4 distinct plays. Using my paperback copies will be easier. The first play is Richard II. The second play is Henry IV, Part 1. The third play is Henry IV, Part 2. And the fourth play is Henry V. When you combined all of them together, this is the Henriad. These plays were written between 1595 and 1599. Now, sometimes the Henriad is called the second tetralogy because Shakespeare and his collaborators, Thomas Nash and Christopher Marlowe, put together another tetralogy that was written between 1592 and 1594. This tetralogy, some call the first tetralogy, is made up of these 4 plays. The first play in the first tetralogy is Henry VI, Part 1. The second play of the first tetralogy is Henry VI, Part 2. The third play of the first tetralogy is Henry VI, Part 3. And the fourth play of the first tetralogy is the masterpiece Richard III. The first tetralogy, the earlier series that was written, covers the troubled reign of Henry V's son, King Henry VI, who's made king at the age of 6 months after his father, Henry V, dies suddenly in 1422 in France while he's on campaign during the 100 Years' War. Now, Henry VI is a weak king. He's innocent, he's gullible, although by the end of the series, there's a certain spiritual strength that shows up in the end that's very reminiscent of Richard II as well. The 3 Henry VI plays cover his infancy, then his majority in 1437, and then the ensuing loss of England's holdings in France, holdings that were gained by his father, Henry V, which is the subject of the Henry V play. It also covers popular rebellions, the political fallout of Henry VI's grandfather, Henry IV's usurpation of the crown of Richard II, England being broken down into fractions, resulting in a horrible civil war between Lancaster and York that results with Henry VI murdered and losing his crown, and ends with the masterpiece Richard III, about a hunchback king who murders not only Henry VI, but also sets up the murders of his brothers. This series has some great scenes. For example, in the first part of Henry VI, Henry VI Part 1, Joan of Arc, the famous savior of France who God spoke to her and she ended up defeating the English, God was on the side of France. Well, she turns into a demon and is also pregnant. The English have Joan on the stake. They have all the wood around her. They're ready to burn her at the stake. And Jean de Pucelle, which means Joan the Virgin or the Maid, pleads to the English.
Will nothing turn your unrelenting hearts? Then Joan, discover thine infirmity, that warranteth by law to be thy privilege. I am with child, you bloody homicides. Murder not then the fruit within my womb, although ye hale me to a violent death.
Now heaven forfend, the holy maid, the virgin, with child? In Henry VI Part 3, you even find a kind of hidden sonnet, like in Romeo, when Henry VI is standing on a hill, or sitting on a hill like a shepherd, watching as his wife and son lead the Lancaster army against York. Just listen to the rhyme scheme. Often you're going to hear rime equivoque, the rhyming of the same word, because it's rhyming, it's not antistrophe, the repetition of a word at the end of the line. Henry's alone on a hill as the battle's raging. This battle fares like to the morning war. It's like morning is like a war, when dying clouds contend or fight with growing light. What time or when the shepherd, blowing of his nails, can neither call it perfect day nor night, right? Because it's in the middle. Now sways it this way like a mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometime the flood prevails and then the wind, now one the better than another best. That's also Ploki and Polyptoton, both tugging to be victors breast to breast, yet neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war, this terrible war, this dangerous war, bad war. When you read the rest of this speech or this soliloquy by Henry VI, it will remind you of Richard II's language, filled with flowers and filled with pathos. He portrays himself as a shepherd, and then suddenly on the scene, two soldiers appear dragging bodies ready to loot them, and once they lift the helmets off each one of them, one discovers he has murdered his father, and one has discovered he has murdered his son.
Wow, that's some drama there.
Richard II is famous for its opening soliloquy. Now is the winter of our discontent, when glorious summer by the son of York, and all the clouds that lured upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. And it also ends with him on Boswell Field looking for his horse. It's also a famous line from Richard III. Now he's King Richard. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Richard III is great because Richard is always breaking the fourth wall to tell us what he's going to do. These, of course, are designated as asides, but there's tons of them in the play. Now, let me just say right now that Shakespeare's audience would know this history. I'm not spoiling the plot lines when I'm telling you this. You should know that Richard II is going to be overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke. This is part of history. It's a well-known fact. What's intriguing the audience is how it's going to be executed. The second tetralogy, the Henriad, deals with that traumatic event and its lasting consequences. You know, how Richard II was a young and ineffective king. He's deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, and then he's murdered. We all know this. And then what are the consequences on the kingdom? There are political consequences, constant rebellions for Henry IV, the new king, as well as personal ones. He has an heir, Prince Hal, who's basically a bum, who hangs around in bars and brothels with a fat scoundrel named Falstaff. The Henriad's serious side is it focuses on Hal, this bum prince's growth and maturity from a loser bum to king and military hero. As Henry V, in the final play, he wins one of England's greatest military battles, the Battle of Agincourt, where he cements a victory in France and ushers in a new phase in the 100-Year War. But then, after the scenes are over, a sour note shows up. It's the appearance of a sonnet that will remind the audience of the history to come, that Henry V is going to die young and he's going to leave an infant king. Now, Falstaff is one of Shakespeare's greatest creations and was Queen Elizabeth's favorite character. So much so that when Falstaff dies in Henry V, she was so upset that she asked Shakespeare. She was so bummed out that Shakespeare had killed off her favorite character that she insisted that he write a new play and make him the star. This is his spin-off, The Merry Wives of Windsor. It's a comedy that has all the characters from Henry IV Part 1 and 2 and Henry V, although the Henriad has produced many TV shows as well as a Netflix movie, The King. The Merry Wives of Windsor has produced 10 operas. Now, the first tetralogy, the first one that was written, begins with the funeral of Henry V in 1422 and will end with Richard III's defeat or death on Boswell Field in 1485. So the dating is 1422 to 1485. Now, since the second tetralogy, or the Henriad, the series we're going to study, begins with the banishment of Henry Bolingbroke by Richard II in 1398 and ends with the death of Henry V in 1422, hence 1398 to 1422, the second tetralogy, or the Henriad, is a prequel to the first. That means as a prequel, it was written in order to clarify the background of the disaster that makes up the first tetralogy, the fall of England's French lands with the loss of the 100 Years' War, as well as the resulting Civil War, or the War of the Roses. So you have basically two separate tetralogies, one written before, one written after, okay? But then you also have chronology. This one is first, this group is second, and then to mix things up again, this one may have actually been written like this. The first folio presents it in this new revised order. Looking at the table of contents for the first folio, where we're told there are comedies, tragedies, and histories. Under histories, we see first Richard II, as you know. We see the first part of King Henry IV, the second part of King Henry IV, the life of King Henry V, and then we see Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and then the life and death of Richard III, but then it also carries on too. So you have to think of this as like Star Wars. The first tetralogy is like the original Star Wars trilogy. Then the prequel was written to account for what happens in the central parts of Star Wars. But like Star Wars, it can also be reordered chronologically. So when I was a kid, there was only Star Wars and then Empire Strikes Back, which we were blown away by, and then a little disappointed with the Muppets in Return of the Jedi, which was originally going to be called Revenge of the Jedi. And then suddenly a prequel's made, and then my Star Wars becomes number 4, episode 4. The new one, number 5, becomes number 1, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then Rogue One appears before number 4, and then we have 7, 8, 9. I mean, the numbers go on, but you get the idea of how this works. The same thing is happening with the Henriad. Let's begin the first play in this series, the Henriad, the second tetralogy, Richard II, where the roots of the disaster that will ultimately lead to Tudor rule will come about.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.